Margaret wiped the sweat from her forehead as the Arizona sun beat down on her old pickup truck. 6 months ago, she never imagined she'd be living in the back of this rusty vehicle behind a gas station. Life had a funny way of turning everything upside down when you least expected it. Her husband Robert had fought cancer for 2 years. The medical bills kept coming even after he was gone. The house they'd lived in for 30 years? Gone to pay the doctors? The savings account they'd built? Up? Empty. At 58 years old, Margaret found herself with nothing but this truck and the clothes on her back. The gas station owner, Eddie, let her park behind his building as long as she didn't cause trouble. She kept to herself, used the bathroom when she bought something, and tried to stay invisible. Most days she'd drive around looking for work, but nobody wanted to hire a homeless woman with gray hair and worn-out shoes. That Tuesday evening, Margaret was setting up her small camping chair when she heard something. A rustling sound came from the desert brush about 50 yards away. She stopped and listened. Arizona had all kinds of animals that could hurt you. Rattlesnakes, coyotes, javelinas. She grabbed the flashlight Robert had kept in the truck's glove box. The rustling stopped. Margaret waited, holding her breath. Then she saw a flash of movement behind a large cactus. Something, or someone, was definitely out there. She clicked on the flashlight and slowly walked toward the sound. "Hello?" She called out softly. "Is someone there?" A small figure darted from one hiding spot to another. It was too quick to be an animal, and too small to be a grown person. Margaret's heart started beating faster. She moved closer, keeping the flashlight pointed down so it wouldn't blind whoever was hiding. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said in the gentlest voice she could manage. "Are you okay?" From behind a cluster of rocks, she could see a pair of dark eyes watching her. They belonged to a boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. His black hair was dusty and tangled. His clothes looked like they'd been nice once, a button-up shirt and dark pants, but now they were torn and dirty. The boy's feet were bare, and Margaret could see dried blood on them. He looked scared, hungry, and exhausted. But there was something else in his eyes, a kind of sadness that reminded her of a wounded animal. "Oh, honey," Margaret whispered. "What happened to you?" The boy didn't answer. He just stared at her with those big, frightened eyes. Margaret could see him shaking, though the desert was still warm from the day's heat. She slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bottle of water. She'd been saving it for the morning, but this child needed it more than she did. Margaret set the bottle on the ground between them and stepped back. "It's okay," she said. "You can have it." The boy looked at the water, then at Margaret, then back at the water. After what felt like forever, he crept forward and grabbed the bottle. He drank it so fast that Margaret worried he might choke. When the bottle was empty, the boy wiped his mouth and said something in a language Margaret didn't understand. His voice was hoarse and quiet. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, I don't know what you're saying," Margaret said. "Do you speak English?" The boy nodded slowly. "Little bit," he said with a thick accent. "What's your name?" "Joseph," the boy whispered. "That's a nice name. I'm Margaret." She smiled at him. "Are you hurt, Joseph?" He looked down at his feet and nodded. Margaret felt her heart break a little. This child was alone in the desert, hurt and scared. She thought about her own son, David, who lived far away in Oregon with his family. She imagined how she'd feel if he was lost and frightened somewhere, hoping a kind stranger would help him. "Are you hungry?" she asked. Joseph's eyes lit up, and he nodded again. Margaret walked back to her truck with Joseph following at a safe distance. She opened the small cooler where she kept her food. There wasn't much: some crackers, a can of beans, and an apple that was starting to get soft. She'd planned to make it last 2 more days, but looking at this hungry child, she knew what she had to do. She handed Joseph the crackers and the apple. He took them with both hands and ate like he hadn't seen food in days. Margaret opened the can of beans and gave him a plastic spoon. While Joseph ate, Margaret got a better look at him in the light from her truck. His skin was darker than hers, and his features looked Native American. His clothes, though dirty and torn, seemed like the kind kids wore to school or church. But what was a school-age boy doing alone in the desert? "Where are your parents, Joseph?" Margaret asked gently. The boy's face changed. The little bit of peace that had come from eating disappeared. He looked around nervously, as if he expected someone to jump out of the darkness. "Far," he said. "Very far." "How did you get here?" Joseph was quiet for a long time. Then he pointed north and said, "Walking. Walking long time." Margaret looked in the direction he pointed. There was nothing but desert and mountains for miles. "How could a child have walked that far alone? Were you running away from something?" she asked. Joseph's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't cry. He just nodded. Margaret wanted to ask more questions, but she could see the boy was exhausted. Whatever had happened to him, whatever he was running from, it could wait until morning. Right now, he needed rest and safety. "You can sleep here tonight," she told him. "I have an extra blanket." Joseph looked surprised. "You help me?" "Of course, I'll help you. You're just a child." She pulled out the thin blanket she used as a pillow and handed it to Joseph. He wrapped it around himself and curled up on the ground next to her truck. Margaret sat in her camping chair nearby, keeping watch. As the night got colder, she could hear Joseph shivering. Without thinking about it, Margaret got her own blanket and covered him with it too. She'd be cold, but she'd been cold before. This boy needed warmth more than she did. Around midnight, Joseph started talking in his sleep. He spoke in that other language, but his voice sounded scared and angry. He tossed and turned, and Margaret could tell he was having nightmares. She wanted to wake him up and comfort him, but she didn't want to frighten him. Instead, she moved her chair closer and began humming an old lullaby she used to sing to David when he was little. It seemed to calm Joseph down. His breathing became deeper and more peaceful. Margaret stayed awake all night, watching over this strange child who had appeared in her life. She thought about how quickly everything could change. Yesterday, she was a homeless woman with no purpose. Tonight, she was protecting someone who needed her help. As the sun started to rise, Joseph woke up slowly. He looked confused for a moment, then remembered where he was. He sat up and stared at Margaret. "You stayed," he said, sounding surprised. "I told you I would," Margaret replied. Joseph smiled for the first time since she'd met him. It transformed his whole face and made him look like the child he was supposed to be. "Thank you," he said clearly. Margaret smiled back. "You're welcome, honey." But as the morning light grew brighter, Margaret started to worry. This boy was obviously running from something or someone. What if they came looking for him? What if she was breaking the law by helping him? What if she was putting both of them in danger? She looked at Joseph's trusting face and made a decision. Whatever trouble this might bring, she couldn't abandon a child who needed her help. For the first time in months, Margaret felt like she had a purpose again. She was going to protect this boy no matter what it cost her. The next morning, Margaret knew she had to learn more about Joseph's situation. But first, she needed to take care of his injured feet. She tore strips from one of her old t-shirts and used the last of her first aid supplies to clean and bandage his cuts. Joseph winced but didn't complain as she worked. He watched her face carefully, as if he was trying to figure out if he could really trust her. "These will help," Margaret said as she finished wrapping his feet. "But you need real shoes." Joseph looked at the makeshift bandages and then at Margaret. "Why you help me?" The question caught her off guard. Margaret thought about it for a moment. "Because you need help, and I can give it. Sometimes that's all the reason you need." As the day went on, Margaret began to piece together Joseph's story. It came out slowly in broken English mixed with words in his native language. He was Apache from a reservation about 200 miles north, but he hadn't been living there recently. "School," Joseph said, his face darkening. "Bad school. Far from home." Through careful questions and Joseph's limited English, Margaret learned about the boarding school where Joseph had been sent. It was one of those government institutions that took Native American children away from their families. The idea was to educate them, but from what Joseph described, it sounded more like punishment. No Apache words, Joseph explained, touching his mouth. Only English. They wash mouth with soap if we speak Apache. Margaret felt sick. They washed your mouth with soap? Joseph nodded. And cut hair, and no songs, no stories. No. He struggled to find the English word, then pointed to the sky and made gestures that looked like dancing. Ceremonies? Margaret guessed. Yes, no ceremonies. They say Apache ways are. He couldn't find the word, but his face showed the pain of whatever they had called his culture. Margaret was getting angry. She'd heard about these schools, but hearing about them from a child who'd lived through it was different. No wonder Joseph had run away. How long were you there? She asked. Joseph held up 3 fingers. 3 years. Since I am 9. 3 years. This 12-year-old boy had spent a quarter of his life in a place that tried to erase who he was. Margaret wanted to hug him, but she could tell he was still scared of sudden movements. Where were you trying to go when I found you? She asked. Home. To grandfather. To my people. Joseph's eyes filled with determination. But I get lost. Very tired. Very hungry. Margaret understood now. Joseph had escaped from the boarding school and was trying to walk 200 miles home across the desert. No wonder he was in such bad shape when she found him. That afternoon, Eddie, the gas station owner, came around to check on her. Margaret had moved Joseph to the other side of her truck, hoping Eddie wouldn't notice him. But Eddie had sharp eyes. You got company? He asked, looking suspicious. Just a friend passing through? Margaret said quickly. Eddie looked around the truck and saw Joseph sitting on the ground. That's a kid. Where'd he come from? Margaret's heart started racing. He's my nephew. His family dropped him off for a visit. Eddie squinted at Joseph, then at Margaret. Doesn't look much like family to me. Kid looks Indian. His father is Native American. Margaret lied. Mixed family. Eddie didn't look convinced, but he shrugged. Well, keep him quiet. I don't want any trouble from social services or the cops. After Eddie left, Margaret realized how dangerous this situation was becoming. If Eddie got suspicious enough to call the authorities, they'd take Joseph away. And Margaret knew enough about the system to know they'd probably send him right back to that terrible school. That evening, as they shared a can of soup Margaret had bought with her last few dollars, Joseph taught her some Apache words. He pointed to things around them, rock, tree, sky, water, and said the Apache words slowly so she could repeat them. Say, he said, touching a stone. Say, Margaret repeated. Joseph smiled and nodded. It was the first time she'd seen him look truly happy. Then he pointed to her and said, Shima. What does that mean? Margaret asked. Joseph thought for a moment, searching for the English word. Mother, he said quietly. Margaret felt tears in her eyes. This child who had been torn away from his family was calling her mother. It was both heartbreaking and beautiful. As night fell, Margaret made a decision. They couldn't stay behind the gas station much longer. It was too risky. She remembered seeing some old mining areas deeper in the desert when she'd driven around looking for work. Maybe they could find a better hiding place there. Joseph, she said, we need to move somewhere safer. Will you trust me? The boy looked scared again. They find me? Not if I can help it, Margaret promised. Early the next morning, before Eddie arrived at the gas station, Margaret and Joseph packed up their few belongings and drove deeper into the desert. Margaret remembered seeing an old mining road about 10 miles away. It was rough and barely passable, but her truck could handle it. They found what she was looking for, a small cave that had been carved out of a hillside, probably by miners looking for silver or copper years ago. It was hidden from the main road and provided shelter from the sun and wind. This will be our home for now, Margaret told Joseph. Joseph explored the cave and seemed to approve. Good hiding place, he said. They spent the day setting up their new camp. Margaret showed Joseph how to collect rainwater in containers, how to find which cactus fruits were safe to eat, and how to tell direction by looking at the sun. Robert, had taught her these things during their camping trips, back when they had money for vacations. Joseph was a quick learner. He also taught Margaret things: how to read the signs that said water was nearby, how to walk quietly on the rocky ground, how to stay cool by following the shade patterns. In the evenings, Joseph would tell her stories about his grandfather and his life on the reservation before the school took him away. He spoke about ceremonies where people danced around fires, about learning to track animals, about his grandmother who made beautiful pottery. "Grandfather knows old ways," Joseph said one night as they sat by their small campfire. "He teaches me to be Apache, to be proud." "Tell me about your grandfather," Margaret said. Joseph's face lit up. "He is chief. Not government chief, but real chief. People listen to him. He knows medicine plants. He knows the old stories." "What's his name?" "William. But Apache name is—" Joseph said something in Apache that Margaret couldn't pronounce. "Means crow feather." "Crow feather," Margaret repeated slowly. Joseph nodded. "He has black feathers from sacred crow. Very powerful." Margaret could hear the love and respect in Joseph's voice when he talked about his grandfather. It made her heart ache to think about how much this man must be missing his grandson. On their third night in the cave, Joseph had another nightmare. This time, Margaret didn't hesitate. She went to him and gently shook his shoulder. "Joseph, wake up. You're safe." He woke up crying and speaking in Apache. Without thinking, Margaret pulled him close and held him while he cried. He was so small and thin in her arms. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you." After a while, Joseph's crying stopped. But he didn't pull away from Margaret's hug. "I miss my family," he said quietly. "I know you do, sweetheart. And they miss you too. Will I ever see them again?" Margaret didn't know how to answer that. The boarding school would be looking for him. The government would want to send him back. How could a homeless woman help a child find his way home to people who lived hundreds of miles away? But looking down at Joseph's trusting face, Margaret knew she had to try. "Yes," she said firmly. "Somehow we'll get you home." Joseph smiled and closed his eyes. For the first time since she'd found him, he slept peacefully through the night. Margaret stayed awake, planning. She didn't know how she was going to do it, but she was going to find a way to get this child back to his family, even if it meant risking everything she had left. Margaret woke up early on their fourth day together with a bad feeling in her stomach. Something felt different. The desert was too quiet, even for the early morning hours. She crawled to the mouth of the cave and looked out carefully. In the distance, she could see dust clouds rising from the main road. Vehicles were driving back and forth in patterns that looked like they were searching for something. Or someone. Margaret's heart started pounding. She crept back into the cave where Joseph was still sleeping and gently shook his shoulder. "Joseph, wake up quietly," she whispered. The boy's eyes opened immediately. 3 years at the boarding school had taught him to wake up fast and scared. "What is wrong?" he asked, sitting up quickly. "I think people are looking for you. We need to be very careful today." Joseph's face went pale. He crawled to the cave entrance and looked out at the distant vehicles. His whole body started shaking. "They find me," he said, his voice full of fear. "They take me back." Margaret put her arm around him. "Not if I can help it, but we need to move deeper into the cave and stay very quiet." They gathered their few belongings and moved to the back of the cave where the shadows were darkest. Margaret had some crackers and water, but she was worried about how long they could hide here. If the searchers had dogs, it would only be a matter of time before they were found. As the morning went on, the activity on the road increased. Margaret counted at least 6 different vehicles driving up and down the area. Some were police cars, but others looked like government vehicles. She even saw men in suits walking around with what looked like maps. Around noon, one of the vehicles turned onto the old mining road. "Stay here and don't make any noise," Margaret told Joseph. "I'm going to see how close they get." She crawled to a position where she could watch the road without being seen. A black SUV was driving slowly along the rough mining road, stopping every few hundred yards. Two men got out and walked around, looking at the ground as if they were tracking something. Margaret's blood ran cold. These weren't just random searchers. They knew what they were doing. The SUV got within half a mile of their cave before the road became too rough for it to continue. The men got out and started walking, examining the ground carefully. One of them had binoculars and was scanning the hillsides. Margaret crawled back to Joseph. "We need to leave, now." "Where we go?" Joseph asked, his eyes wide with fear. Margaret thought quickly. She remembered seeing another old mining area about 2 miles further into the desert. It was in the opposite direction from where the searchers were coming. If they could get there without being seen, they might have a chance. "There's another place we can hide, but we have to walk and we have to be very careful not to leave tracks." Joseph nodded. Despite his fear, he trusted Margaret completely now. They gathered their things and crept out of the cave. Margaret led Joseph along the rocky ground, trying to stay where their footprints wouldn't show. It was slow going, especially with Joseph's injured feet, but they made steady progress away from the searchers. After about an hour of careful walking, they reached the other mining area. This one was older and more run down than their first hiding place. But Margaret found something even better, an old mining shaft that went down into the ground. It was like a cave, but completely hidden from above. "Can you climb down?" Margaret asked Joseph, looking into the shaft. Joseph peered over the edge. It wasn't very deep, maybe 8 feet. And there were old wooden supports that could work like a ladder. "Yes," he said. "I can do it." Joseph went down first, and Margaret lowered their supplies to him. Then she climbed down herself. The shaft was cool and dark, but it felt safe. They settled in to wait. Margaret shared some crackers with Joseph and tried to keep his spirits up by asking him to teach her more Apache words. But she could tell the boy was getting more scared as the day went on. "What happens if they catch me?" Joseph asked quietly. Margaret had been dreading this question. She knew she should probably be honest with him, but looking at his frightened face, she couldn't bring herself to tell him the whole truth. "They'll want to take you back to the school," she said carefully. "I won't go," Joseph said firmly. "I run away again." "Joseph, listen to me. If they find us, I want you to tell them that I kidnapped you. Tell them I forced you to come with me and you were trying to get away." Joseph looked shocked. "No, that is lie." "I know it's a lie, but it will protect you. If they think I kidnapped you, they might not punish you as much for running away." "But what happens to you?" Margaret tried to smile. "Don't worry about me. I'm a grown-up. I can take care of myself." The truth was, Margaret knew exactly what would happen to her if they were caught. Harboring a runaway miner was a serious crime. She could go to prison, but that didn't matter anymore. This child's safety was more important than her own freedom. As evening approached, Margaret could still hear vehicles in the distance. The search wasn't stopping. In fact, it seemed to be getting bigger. Joseph was drawing pictures in the dirt, with a stick. Margaret looked at what he was drawing and felt her heart break. He'd drawn a picture of children standing in lines, all with the same short haircuts. Above them was a big building with bars on the windows. At the bottom of the picture, he'd drawn himself running away, with tears on his face. "Is that the school?" Margaret asked gently. Joseph nodded. "Every day same. Wake up, stand in line, eat bad food, sit in classroom. Learn English words. No Apache, no family, no stories." He added more details to his drawing. Children scrubbing floors. Children getting their hair cut. Children standing in corners as punishment. "What did you do when you felt sad?" Margaret asked. "At night, when teacher's not watching, I remember grandfather's stories. In my head, I hear his voice telling about the old days, about brave Apache warriors, about the sacred places in our mountains." Joseph's voice got stronger as he talked about these memories. "Grandfather says Apache spirit is like the wind. You can't catch wind. You can't lock up wind. Apache spirit always finds way to be free." "Your grandfather sounds very wise." "He is," Joseph said with pride. "When I was small, before school, he'd take me to sacred places. He'd show me where our ancestors lived. He'd teach me plants for medicine, songs for ceremonies. Joseph started singing very quietly in Apache. It was a beautiful, haunting melody that seemed to fill the small space where they were hiding. Even though Margaret couldn't understand the words, she could feel the power and sadness in the song. When he finished, Joseph wiped his eyes. "Grandfather, teach me that song. It's about going home." Margaret felt tears in her own eyes. This 12-year-old boy had endured things that would break most adults. But he still had hope. He still believed he could find his way home. As night fell, Margaret made a difficult decision. They couldn't keep running forever. Joseph needed to get back to his family, and she was just one homeless woman with limited resources. The only way this was going to end well was if Joseph's people came looking for him. "Joseph," she said carefully, "does your grandfather know you ran away from the school?" "Maybe. School maybe tell him I am gone, but they not tell him where I go. If your grandfather was looking for you, where would he search?" Joseph thought about this. He know old Apache ways. He know how to track. He know desert. Joseph's eyes lit up. "He find me. Grandfather always find what he looks for." Margaret hoped Joseph was right, because if his grandfather was looking for him, he might be their only hope of getting out of this situation safely. That night, Margaret stayed awake listening for sounds of the search. Around midnight she heard voices in the distance. They were getting closer. She woke Joseph gently. "We might need to move again. Are you ready?" Joseph sat up and listened to the voices. Suddenly his face changed. He looked confused, then excited. "That's not them," he whispered. "What do you mean?" Joseph climbed quietly toward the opening of the shaft and listened more carefully. Then he turned back to Margaret with the biggest smile she'd seen from him yet. "That's Apache," he said. "Someone speaking Apache." Margaret's heart jumped. Could it really be? Had Joseph's family found them? Or was this just wishful thinking from a scared child who wanted to go home? They were about to find out. Margaret's heart was beating so fast she thought Joseph might hear it. She helped him climb up to where they could both listen more carefully to the voices in the distance. The voices were definitely speaking in a native language, but Margaret couldn't tell if it was Apache or something else. Joseph, however, was getting more excited by the minute. "It's Apache," he whispered. I hear Uncle Tommy." Joseph started to climb out of the shaft, but Margaret grabbed his arm. "Wait," she said, "we need to be sure. What if it's a trick? What if the government people brought Apache translators to help them search?" Joseph paused. Margaret was right to be careful. The boarding school had used Native American staff members to help control the students. They'd learned not to trust someone just because they looked like family. But as they listened more, Joseph became more confident. "No," he said. "That's Uncle Tommy. He teaches me to hunt rabbits. And that sounds like Charlie Big Horse. They wouldn't help government people." Margaret was still nervous, but she could see how badly Joseph wanted to believe his family had come for him. They listened for another few minutes, and Margaret began to hear something else in the voices. They sounded worried, not angry. They sounded like people searching for someone they loved, not like people trying to catch a criminal. "Okay," Margaret finally said, "but I go first. If it's safe, I'll call for you." Margaret climbed out of the shaft and crept toward the voices. In the moonlight, she could see 3 figures moving across the desert. They had flashlights, but they were keeping them pointed down at the ground. They were definitely tracking something. As she got closer, Margaret could see that all 3 men had long black hair and were wearing what looked like traditional clothing mixed with modern clothes. One man was older, maybe in his 60s, with gray streaking his black hair. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew the desert well. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped out where they could see her. The 3 men stopped immediately. The older man said something in Apache, and one of the younger men translated, "He wants to know who you are and if you've seen a young boy." Margaret's relief was so strong she almost fell down. These were Joseph's people. "Yes," she said quickly. "I've been taking care of him." He's safe." The older man stepped forward. Even in the dim light, Margaret could see the authority in his bearing. This had to be the grandfather Joseph had talked about so much. The translator spoke again. "This is Chief William Crow Feather. He says to bring the boy." Margaret turned and called back toward the mining shaft. "Joseph, it's okay. Your grandfather is here." A few seconds later, Joseph came running out of the darkness. When he saw the older man, he let out a cry of joy and ran straight into his arms. "Grandfather! Grandfather!" Joseph was crying and laughing at the same time, speaking rapidly in Apache. The old man held Joseph tightly, and Margaret could see tears streaming down his weathered face. He spoke softly to the boy in their language, stroking his hair and checking him over to make sure he wasn't badly hurt. The translator, who looked like he might be in his 30s, turned to Margaret. "I'm Tommy Crow Feather, Joseph's uncle. Chief Crow Feather wants to know how you found his grandson." Margaret told them the whole story, how she'd discovered Joseph hiding in the desert, how she'd shared her food and water with him, how they'd hidden from the searchers. As she talked, she could see the old chief watching her carefully, studying her face as if he was trying to see into her soul. When she finished, Tommy translated for his father. The chief asked several questions in Apache and Tommy translated them for Margaret. "He wants to know why you helped a child you didn't know." "Because he needed help," Margaret said simply. "He was scared and hungry and hurt. I couldn't just leave him." "He asks why you didn't turn Joseph over to the authorities." Margaret thought about this carefully. "Because Joseph told me about the school, about what they did to him there. I couldn't send a child back to a place that hurt him." The chief nodded when Tommy translated this. He spoke again, and Tommy smiled. "He says you have the heart of a grandmother, even though you are not Apache." The third man, who Tommy introduced as Charlie Big Horse, had been examining the area where Margaret and Joseph had been hiding. He came back and spoke to the chief in Apache. "Charlie says you did a good job hiding from the searchers," Tommy told Margaret. "He can see you kept Joseph safe and fed, even though you don't have much yourself." Margaret looked down at her worn clothes and dirty hands. It was obvious she was homeless. She wondered what these men thought of her. Chief Crow Feather asked another question, and this time his voice sounded more serious. "He wants to know about the people who are searching. How many? What kind of vehicles? Are they still nearby?" Margaret described everything she'd seen. The police cars, the government vehicles, the men in suits who seemed to know what they were doing. The chief and his companions had a quick conversation in Apache. Margaret could tell they were making plans. "We need to move quickly," Tommy explained. "The searchers will keep looking until they find something. But my father knows places where they won't think to look." Chief Crow Feather walked over to Margaret and spoke directly to her. His English wasn't perfect, but it was much better than Joseph's. "You saved my grandson," he said in a deep, gravelly voice. "You keep him safe when his own people could not. This makes you family." Margaret felt tears in her eyes. "I just did what anyone would do." The chief shook his head. "No, many people would call authorities. Turn in runaway boy. Get reward money. You share your food when you have little. You risk trouble to protect child who is not yours. This is not what anyone would do. This is what family does." Joseph ran over and hugged Margaret around the waist. "You come with us," he said. "You come to reservation. Grandfather can protect you too." Margaret looked around at these three men who had risked their own safety to come looking for one lost boy. She thought about the weeks she'd spent sleeping in her truck, wondering if her life had any purpose left. "I can't," she said reluctantly. "I don't belong on your reservation. And the authorities will be looking for me now too. I'll only bring you trouble." Chief Crow Feather studied her face again. Then he spoke to Tommy in Apache. "My father says you're wrong about two things," Tommy translated. "First, you do belong with us, because you proved yourself worthy when you protected our child. Second, you won't bring us trouble. We will handle any trouble that comes." The chief reached into a leather bag he carried and pulled out something wrapped in soft cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a beautiful necklace made of silver and turquoise with black feathers attached. "This is sacred necklace," he said to Margaret, "made by my grandmother's grandmother, only given to family members or to those who do great service for our people." He placed the necklace around Margaret's neck. It felt heavier than she expected, and somehow warmer than the cool desert air. "You are family now," he said simply. Joseph was practically bouncing with excitement. "You come home with us, grandmother will cook for you, I show you sacred places, I teach you more Apache words." Margaret touched the necklace, amazed by the intricate workmanship. She'd never owned anything so beautiful. "But I have nothing to offer you," she said. "I'm homeless. I don't have money or skills or—" Chief Crowfeather held up his hand to stop her. "You have what matters most. You have good heart. You have courage. You have love for children. These are things we need. On reservation." Tommy smiled. "Besides, my father has been worried about kids like Joseph who run away from government schools. He's been wanting to start a program to help them. Sounds like you already know how to do that job." Margaret looked around at these kind faces in the moonlight. For the first time in months, she felt like she might have found a place where she belonged. But before she could say anything else, they all heard the sound of vehicles getting closer. "Time to go," Charlie said urgently. Chief Crowfeather led them quickly across the desert to where they had hidden their own truck. It was an old pickup, but it looked much more reliable than Margaret's rust bucket. As they loaded up to leave, Margaret realized she would have to abandon her truck. It had been her home for 6 months, her only possession of any value. Joseph seemed to understand what she was thinking. "Don't be sad," he said. "Now you have real home. Better than truck." Margaret looked back one more time at the vehicle that had sheltered her during the hardest time of her life. Then she climbed into the truck with Joseph's family and didn't look back again. As they drove away into the desert night heading toward the Apache reservation, Margaret realized that saving one lost child had somehow saved her too. The drive to the Apache reservation took most of the night. Margaret sat in the back of the truck with Joseph, who fell asleep against her shoulder as they bounced along the desert roads. Chief Crowfeather drove while Tommy and Charlie took turns watching for any vehicles that might be following them. As the sun began to rise, Margaret got her first look at the reservation. It wasn't what she had expected. The landscape was beautiful. Rolling hills covered with oak trees and grassland, with mountains rising in the distance. But many of the houses they passed looked run down, and she could see the effects of poverty everywhere. "Government doesn't give us much money to fix things," Tommy explained, when he saw Margaret looking around. "We do the best we can with what we have." They drove through the small town center, past a trading post, a health clinic, and a school. Margaret was surprised to see that the school looked well-maintained and had signs in both English and Apache. "We fought for years to get our own school," Tommy said proudly. "No more sending our kids away to boarding schools that try to kill their spirits." Chief Crowfeather pulled up in front of a modest house with a large front porch. The yard was full of children's toys and had a vegetable garden on one side. Before they could even get out of the truck, the front door opened and a woman came running out. "Joseph!" she cried, pulling the boy into a fierce hug. "We were so worried." This was clearly Joseph's grandmother. She was probably in her 50s, with graying hair braided down her back and kind eyes that were now filled with tears of relief. She spoke rapidly to Joseph in Apache, checking him over just like his grandfather had done. Then she turned to Margaret. Without hesitation, she pulled Margaret into a hug just as warm as the one she'd given Joseph. "Thank you," she said in English. "Thank you for bringing our boy home." More people began appearing from neighboring houses. Word traveled fast in a small community, and everyone wanted to see that Joseph was safe. Children peeked shyly from behind their parents. Elderly people came out of their houses despite the early hour. Everyone seemed to know Joseph, and everyone seemed relieved to see him. Chief Crowfeather spoke to the crowd in Apache, gesturing toward Margaret. She could tell he was telling them what she had done for Joseph. The people began looking at her differently, not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged. Joseph's grandmother, who introduced herself as Helen, insisted that Margaret come inside for breakfast. The house was small but warm and comfortable. The walls were decorated with beautiful pottery and traditional Apache crafts. Family photos covered every surface. While Helen cooked, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with Joseph and listened to him chatter excitedly about being home. He switched back and forth between English and Apache, sometimes forgetting that Margaret couldn't understand everything he was saying. "He's telling his grandmother about the stories you asked him to tell while you were hiding," Tommy translated, with a smile. "He says you're a good listener." After breakfast, Chief Crow Feather asked Margaret to walk with him. They went outside and sat on the front porch where they could look out over the reservation. "I want to talk to you about something important," he said. "But first, I want you to understand something about Apache ways." Margaret nodded, listening carefully. "In our culture, when someone saves the life of a family member, it creates a sacred bond. You didn't just help Joseph, you risked your own safety to protect him. This makes you part of our family, not just in words, but in our hearts and in our traditions." The chief paused, looking out at the mountains in the distance. "I've been chief of this band for 20 years. In all that time, I've never met a white person who would risk so much for an Apache child they didn't even know. Your actions honor the best traditions of both our peoples." Margaret didn't know what to say. She'd never thought of what she did as particularly honorable. It had just felt like the right thing to do. "I want to offer you something," the chief continued. "But first I need to know, do you have family somewhere who will worry about you?" Margaret thought about her son David in Oregon. They talked on the phone maybe twice a year. He had his own family and his own problems. She'd been too proud to tell him she was homeless. "I have a son," she said honestly. "But we're not close. He doesn't even know about my situation." Chief Crowfeather nodded. "What I'm about to offer you might seem unusual. In fact, some people might not understand it, but I hope you'll consider it carefully." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. 3 months ago, the tribal council voted to buy a piece of land that borders our reservation. We plan to build houses for tribal members who needed homes. Margaret looked at the paper. It appeared to be some kind of legal document. One of those houses was completed last month. It's small, just 2 bedrooms, but it's solid and comfortable. The council had planned to assign it to a family, but yesterday, after hearing what you did for Joseph, we took another vote. Margaret's heart started beating faster. "What kind of vote?" "We voted to give you that house. Not to rent to you, not to loan to you. To give it to you for as long as you want to live there." Margaret stared at him in shock. I don't understand." "Why would you do that?" "Because you earned it. Because you showed us that family isn't just about blood. It's about love and sacrifice and protection. Because we need people like you in our community." Margaret felt dizzy. A house? They were offering her a house? "But I'm not Apache," she said weakly. "No, but you have an Apache heart. And that's what matters." Tommy came out of the house and joined them on the porch. "My father told me about the house offer. I wanted you to know there's more." "More?" "We've been trying to start a program to help kids who run away from boarding schools or have other problems. Kids like Joseph, who need a safe place to stay while we figure out how to help them. We need someone to run that program, someone who understands what these kids are going through." Margaret was having trouble processing all of this. "You want me to work with runaway children?" "You already proved you're good at it," Tommy said with a smile. "Joseph told us how you made him feel safe, how you shared your food even when you didn't have enough, how you taught him survival skills. That's exactly what we need." Chief Crowfeather handed Margaret the paper. "This is the deed to the house. Your name is already on it. The council meeting to make it official is tonight, but as far as we're concerned, you already own it." Margaret looked at the deed. Her name, Margaret Thompson, was printed clearly in the legal language. She had never owned a house before. Even the home she'd shared with Robert had been rented. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll stay," Joseph called from the doorway. "Say you'll be my second grandmother." Margaret looked up at Joseph's hopeful face, then at Chief Crowfeather's kind eyes, then at Tommy's encouraging smile. 6 months ago she'd lost everything and thought her life was over. Now these people who barely knew her were offering her not just a home, but a purpose. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. I mean, really sure? You don't know anything about me except what happened these past few days. Chief Crowfeather was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know that when you found a scared, hungry child in the desert, you gave him your food and water. I know that when you barely had enough for yourself, you shared what little you had. I know that when helping him put you in danger, you helped him anyway. I know that you stayed awake all night to keep him safe. The chief stood up and looked out at his reservation. These are the things that matter. These are the things that tell us who you really are. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. For the first time in months, they were tears of joy instead of sadness. Yes, she said quietly. Yes, I'll stay. Joseph let out a whoop of celebration and ran to hug her. Helen came out of the house, wiping her hands on a dish towel, took one look at Margaret's tears, and immediately pulled her into another warm hug. Welcome home, she said simply. That afternoon, Margaret went to see her new house. It was small but beautiful, with a front porch that looked out toward the mountains. It had running water, electricity, and furniture that the community had donated. In the backyard, someone had planted a small garden. The kids will help you take care of the garden, Tommy explained. It'll be good therapy for them. As Margaret walked through her new home, she thought about the strange turns her life had taken. Losing Robert, losing their home, living in her truck behind a gas station, it had all seemed like the end of everything good in her life. But maybe it hadn't been an ending at all. Maybe it had been the beginning of something better. That evening, the tribal council officially welcomed Margaret as a new member of their community. Chief Crowfeather stood before the gathered people and told the story of how she had protected Joseph. When he finished, the entire community broke into applause. Joseph stood up and made a short speech in Apache. Tommy translated for Margaret. He says that sometimes the spirits send us the help we need in unexpected ways. He says you were sent to save him, but maybe he was sent to save you too. As Margaret looked around at all the faces smiling at her, she realized Joseph might be right. She had saved him from the desert and from the